The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 10. Aesthetic and Ethical Culture. Society is only an enlargement of the individual. Therefore, this contrast and opposition between individual types reproduces itself in a like contrast and opposition between social and national types. We must not go for the best examples to social formulas, which do not really illustrate these tendencies, but are deprivations, deformations, or deceptive conformities. We must not take as an instance of the ethical turn the middle-class Puritanism touched with a narrow, tepid, and conventional religiosity which was so marked an element in the 19th century England. That was not an ethical culture, but simply a local variation of the general type of bourgeois respectability you will find everywhere at a certain stage of civilization. It was Philistinism, pure and simple. Nor should we take as an instance of the aesthetic any merely bohemian society, or such examples as London of the Restoration, or Paris in certain brief periods of its history, that whatever some of its pretensions, had for its principle, always, the indulgence of the average sensational and sensuous man, freed from the conventions of morality by a superficial intellectualism and aestheticism. Nor even can we take Puritan England as the ethical type, for although there was there a strenuous and exaggerated culture of character and the ethical being, the determining tendency was religious, and the religious impulse is a phenomenon quite apart from our other subjective tendencies. Though it influences them all, it is sui generis and must be treated separately. To get at real, if not always quite pure examples of the type, we must go back a little farther in time and contrast early republican Rome, or in Greece itself, Sparta, with Periclean Athens. For as we come down the stream of time in its present curve of evolution, humanity in the mass, carrying in it its past collective experience, becomes more and more complex, and the old distinct types do not recur, or recur precariously and with difficulty. Republican Rome, before it was touched and finally taken captive by conquered Greece, stands out in relief as one of the most striking psychological phenomena of human history. From the point of view of human development, it presents itself as an almost unique experiment in high and strong character building, divorced as far as may be from the sweetness which the sense of beauty and the light which the play of the reason brings into character, and uninspired by the religious temperament, for the early Roman creed was a superstition, a superficial religiosity, and had nothing in it of the true religious spirit. Rome was the human will oppressing and disciplining the emotional and sensational mind in order to arrive at the self-mastery of a definite ethical type. And it was this self-mastery which enabled the Roman public to arrive also at the mastery of its environing world and impose on the nations its public order and law. All supremely successful imperial nations have had in their culture or in their nature, in their formative or expansive periods, this predominance of the will, the character, the impulse to self-discipline and self-mastery, which constitutes the very basis of the ethical tendency. Rome and Sparta, like other ethical civilizations, had their considerable moral deficiencies, tolerated or deliberately encouraged customs and practices which we should call immoral, failed to develop the gentler and more delicate side of moral character. But this is of no essential importance. The ethical idea in man changes and enlarges its scope, but the kernel of the true ethical being remains always the same: will, character, self-discipline, self-mastery. Its limitations at once appear when we look back at its prominent examples. Early Rome and Sparta were barren of thought, art, poetry, literature, the larger mental life, all the amenity and pleasure of human existence. Their art of life excluded or discouraged the delight of living. They were distrustful, as the exclusively ethical man is always distrustful, of free and flexible thought and the aesthetic impulse. The earlier spirit of republican Rome held at arm's length as long as possible the Greek influences that invaded her, closed the schools of the Greek teachers, banished the philosophers, and her most typical minds looked upon the Greek language as a peril, and Greek culture as an abomination. She felt instinctively the arrival at her gates of an enemy, divined a hostile and destructive force fatal to her principle of living. Sparta, though a Hellenic city, admitted as almost the sole aesthetic element of her deliberate ethical training and education a martial music and poetry, and even then, when she wanted a poet of war, she had to import an Athenian. We have a curious example of the repercussion of this instinctive distrust, even on a large and aesthetic Athenian mind, in the utopian speculations of Plato, who felt himself obliged in his Republic first to censure and then to banish the poets from his ideal polity. The end of these purely ethical cultures bears witness to their insufficiency. Either they pass away, leaving nothing or little behind them by which the future can be attracted and satisfied, as Sparta passed, or they collapse in a revolt of the complex nature of man against an unnatural restriction and repression, as the early Roman type collapsed into the egoistic and often orgiastic license of later republican and imperial Rome. The human mind needs to think, feel, enjoy, expand. Expansion is its very nature, and restriction is only useful to it insofar as it helps to steady, guide, and strengthen its expansion. It readily refuses the name of culture to those civilizations or periods, however noble their aim, or even however beautiful in itself their order, which have not allowed an intelligent freedom of development. On the other hand, we are tempted to give the name of a full culture to all those periods and civilizations, whatever their defects, which have encouraged a freely human development, and, like ancient Athens, have concentrated on thought and beauty and the delight of living. But there were in the Athenian development two distinct periods, one of art and beauty, the Athens of Phidias and Sophocles, and one of thought, the Athens of the philosophers. In the first period, the sense of beauty and the need of freedom of life and the enjoyment of life are the determining forces. This Athens thought, but it thought in the terms of art and poetry, in figures of music and drama and architecture and sculpture. It delighted in intellectual discussion, but not so much with any will to arrive at truth as for the pleasure of thinking and the beauty of ideas. It had its moral order, for without that no society can exist. But it had no true ethical impulse or ethical type, only a conventional and customary morality. And when it thought about ethics, it tended to express it in the terms of beauty, to kalon, to epiekos, the beautiful, the becoming. Its very religion was a religion of beauty, and an occasion for pleasant ritual and festivals, and for artistic creation, an aesthetic enjoyment touched with a superficial religious sense. But without character, without some kind of high or strong discipline, there is no enduring power of life. Athens exhausted its vitality within one wonderful century, which left it enervated, will-less, unable to exceed in the struggle of life, uncreative. It turned, indeed, for a time, precisely to that which had been lacking to it, the serious pursuit of truth and the evolution of systems of ethical self-discipline. But it could only think, it could not successfully practice. The later Hellenic mind and Athenian censure of culture gave to Rome the great Stoic system of ethical discipline, which saved her in the midst of the orgies of her first imperial century, but could not itself be stoical in its practice. For to Athens and to the characteristic temperament of Hellas, this thought was a straining to something it had not and could not have. It was the opposite of its nature, and not its fulfillment. This insufficiency of the aesthetic view of life becomes yet more evident when we come down to its other great example, Italy of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was guarded at one time as preeminently a revival of learning. But in its Mediterranean birthplace, it was rather the efflorescence of art and poetry and the beauty of life. Much more than was possible, even in the laxest times of Hellas, aesthetic culture was divorced from the ethical impulse, and at times was even anti-ethical and reminiscent of the license of imperial Rome. It had learning and curiosity, but gave very little of itself to high thought and truth, and the more finished achievements of the reason, although it helped to make free the way for philosophy and science. It so corrupted religion as to provoke in the ethically minded Teutonic nations the violent revolt of the Reformation, which, though it vindicated the freedom of the religious mind, was an insurgence, not so much of the reason, that was left to science, but of the moral instinct and its ethical need. The subsequent prostration and loose weakness of Italy was the inevitable result of the great defect of its period of fine culture. And it needed for its revival the new impulse of thought and will and character given to it by Mazzini. If the ethical impulse is not sufficient by itself for the development of the human being, yet are will, character, self-discipline, self-mastery indispensable to that development. They are the backbone of the mental body. Neither the ethical being nor the aesthetic being is the whole man, nor can either be his sovereign principle. They are merely two powerful elements. Ethical conduct is not the whole of life. Even to say that it is 3/4 of life is to indulge in a very doubtful mathematics. We cannot assign to it its position in any such definite language, but can at best say that its kernel of will, character, and self-discipline are almost the first condition for human self-perfection. The aesthetic sense is equally indispensable, for without that, the self-perfection of the mental being cannot arrive at its object, which is on the mental plane the right and harmonious possession and enjoyment of the truth, power, beauty, and delight of human existence. But neither can be the highest principle of the human order. We can combine them. We can enlarge the sense of ethics by the sense of beauty and delight, and introduce into it, to correct its tendency of hardness and austerity, the element of gentleness, love, amenity, the hedonistic side of morals. We can steady, guide, and strengthen the delight of life by the introduction of the necessary will and austerity and self-discipline, which will give it endurance and purity. These two powers of our psychological being, which represent in us the essential principle of energy and the essential principle of delight. The Indian terms are more profound and expressive, tapas and ananda. And there's a footnote. Tapas is the energizing, conscious power of cosmic being by which the world is created, maintained, and governed. It includes all concepts of force, will, energy, power, everything dynamic and dynamizing. Ananda is the essential nature of bliss of the cosmic consciousness, and inactivity, its delight of self-creation and self-experience. The Indian terms are more profound and expressive, tapas and ananda, can be thus helped by each other, the one to a richer, the other to a greater self-expression. But that even this much reconciliation may come about, they must be taken up and enlightened by a higher principle, which must be capable of understanding and comprehending both equally, and of disengaging and combining disinterestedly their purposes and potentialities. That higher principle seems to be provided for us by the human faculty of reason and intelligent will. Our crowning capacity, it would seem to be, by right, the crowned sovereign of our nature.